which had jumped about 4.5% today, extended its gains a little, lifting the market by the close of trading. Now, also coming up on the show today, Egypt hikes US dollar tariffs on some imported goods. France makes a U-turn on increased fuel prices after 2 weeks of chaos. And a Ghanaian artist transforms tree branches into stunning pieces of furniture. Well, let's start off today's show in Egypt. The government has raised the value of the dollar tariff on imported goods for the first time since devaluation of the country's currency back in November 2016. Now, the higher dollar tariff value will only be implemented on non-basic products such as imported alcohol, makeup, cars and ready-made clothes. Basic goods and necessities will not be affected by the new tariff. Egypt's finance minister says raising the price of the customs dollar for non-basic and entertainment goods is in the interest of citizens and national industries. Well, Yasser Hakim now joins us in Cairo with some more insight into this. Yasser, welcome to the show. Now, Egypt had raised tariff rates on a wide range of imports. Now they're raising the value of the dollar tariff on imported goods. Give us some insight into the government's reasoning behind this and certainly the sorts of goods we'll see being affected.
Yes, Uche, the government says is doing this for three main reasons, amongst others. First of all, is to protect local industries, because some of these products are products that have similar goods that are already being produced in Egypt, and there is no need to import, or it's trying to give more advantage to the locally produced goods to be sold in the market on competition with international imported goods. And we're talking like furniture. We have type of furniture here produced here, so the furniture that is imported is higher. Cars, we have locally assembled cars here, so the imported cars would be more expensive because the tariffs will be higher, and so forth. Then you've got trying to reduce imports so that the government can try to maintain the level of foreign currency reserves it has managed to attract in the last few years. Egypt's foreign reserves had dropped after the 2011 uprising from 36 billion to 19 billion. It was a very dangerous time for Egypt during that period. Now it's back to around $44 billion of foreign reserves. And the government wants to maintain that by reducing imports, keeping the dollars for basic necessities and food rather than issues that are non-basic, and paying for imports that are non-basic. Another issue is obviously after the evaluation of the Egyptian pound, seeing that there is a lot of imports again means that higher value of the dollar against the Egyptian pound, which should weaken the pound even more, and they want to maintain the balance of the Egyptian pound, the value of the Egyptian pound stable against the dollar at the moment, rather than weakening it, and therefore it's also helping to keep the Egyptian pound afloat. And at the same time, these products are either products that are already in the market or products that are not needed, such as cigars, alcohol, caviar, cat and food and dog food, and so forth.
Now, yeah, so we have seen the government implementing a number of measures to curb imports in line with their plan to reduce their import bill. So how are those measures working out so far?
Yes, you have to know first that 85% of Egypt's needs are imported. So Egypt is a highly consumer market that imports most of its needs, and the government is trying to change this culture into being a more productive culture rather than more consuming culture or importing culture. And this is what it has been doing in the last 3 years. And if you look at the imports have dropped by around 20%, which is an extremely high percentage for any country, maintaining that it still imports the important issues like wheat, food, agriculture products and so forth, but it also exports more now. the money that is saved from these imports, as well as the reduction or cuts in subsidies, the money saved from that is used in spending on services for the community, health, education, and also on funding investments that would open projects. These projects that are established will produce goods for the local market that will then mean that we would not need to import as much as before, and it would help to export more. So it's a cycle that the government is trying to get into and trying to encourage businessmen and the community through SMEs as well, and the youth and women to get into this cycle and try to be more productive in the market rather than importing, and giving some kind of protection through the tariffs, through the dollar tariffs, through higher taxes on imports in the last couple of years, to a limit, of course, and helping these businesses to flourish and produce more for the local market and also for the international market. Uche?
Now, of course, we have seen a number of policy changes from the Egyptian government this year. Another move the government is currently considering is changing the way Egypt taxes its banks' profits, basically scrapping a provision that we saw let local banks deduct taxes already paid on treasuries from their bottom line income taxes. Now, explain to us, Yasser, the impact that this will have on local banks.
Well, it's a bit complicated. If you look at the way the system used to be, is that, like you said, the income tax is taken from the bottom line, but then you have the other tools for debt, like the treasuries and the bonds and so forth. They were exempted from the tax. So you had the 20% tax that was implemented on the treasuries. Now the government has put them both together with separate taxation, so the bank would pay two taxes twice: 20% bottom line tax and a 22.5% on the other tools of taxes and other operations. For revenue, income revenue, and therefore the bank in this case would be paying more than before, more taxation on the banks, especially concerning debt to the state and to treasuries and bonds. And this is somehow something that has been not really well welcomed by many of the banks in Egypt.
Well, yeah, so while this could be bad for the banks, it could also encourage lenders in the country to boost credit to the private sector. And it could also push up yields on treasury debt in the country's bonds. So who would be the real beneficiaries of this move?
Yes, and it's obviously clear right now, if you look at the last couple of tenders by the government for treasury bonds, the prices that were set by the banks, they lifted the interest rates to 22%, and the government did not finish these tenders, and it only took around 1/4 of the amount that it wanted at 19% interest rate, which shows that the banks are now moving towards the lending to the private sector, and this is what the target is right now. And the private sector should be benefiting from this in the next few months, and this would also benefit the economy, as the government is saying, is trying to encourage banks to put their finances and their income into lending the local market and the businesses and private sector, to help them establish more businesses, to help them increase production and increase widen their scope of production, and have more emphasis and more channels to fund their projects in Egypt. So this will be a benefit to the private sector in Egypt in the next year or so.
Well, many thanks for that insight, Yasser. Yasser Hakim joining us there in Cairo. Let's stay in the country, where the government has now released the results of a trade with Arab countries for the first 8 months of 2018. Arab states, of course, are Egypt's largest trading partners, amounting to more than 30% of total annual volumes. Now, we compare the latest numbers to those from previous years. Take a look.
The figures show Egypt has increased its trade with Arab countries by 12% year-on-year. United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia topped the list of importers of Egyptian goods with $1.6 billion and $1 billion respectively in 2018. Exports include agricultural products, handicraft, textiles and clothing. There's been a surge in exports since the floating of the Egyptian pound in November 2016, in spite of the recession hitting emerging markets.
Egypt now can have a competitive edge around the emerging markets, that we have a low exchange rate and a low soft cost of the people or the human capital. The World Bank announced yesterday that Egypt has a competitive advantage in the emerging markets, and they forecast that Egypt will not be affected as much as the rest of the emerging markets.
Egypt's North African neighbors have also been trading at higher volumes in 2018. Trade with Algeria and Morocco has increased by 16%, exceeding $1.5 billion for both, compared with last year. And experts say there are plans to grow exports.
To the North African, we are now studying that to export final products, final spare parts, cars, vehicles spare parts, and we are studying that we can export materials like the handicraft. We need more significant change in the regulation between Egypt and the Arab world. What I'm really interested in or admired of the agreement between Egypt and UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. This may increase the trade exchange between Egypt and the Arab countries.
In 2018, Egypt has balanced its trade surplus with 15 out of the 22 Arab countries. There is huge potential for improvement in Arab economies. However, the latest regional conflicts have put constraints on bilateral trade and investments. And the dream of having an Arab common market similar to the EU would be put on hold because of the latest instabilities. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Well, now let's take a look at our corporate headlines today. Royal Dutch Shell is giving its executives a powerful new reason to care about the environment. The Anglo-Dutch company will establish a short-term carbon emissions target starting in 2020. The firm is still in talks with its investors over the precise figures over carbon targets. It aims to set 3 to 5 year targets every year. The energy giant announced in 2016 it will link greenhouse gas emissions to executive compensation. Meanwhile, Kenya's local carriers, Jetways Airlines and Silverstone Air Services, are set to introduce scheduled flights into its neighboring countries. Now, this comes after acquiring permits to start flying passengers beyond the Kenyan border. The latest move gives the airline additional routes and opportunities to assert their presence in the regional space. Meanwhile, Standard Chartered Bank in Nigeria plans to optimize its digital banking solutions. The bank has reiterated its commitment to improving the overall banking experience through digitization and technology. Now, Standard Chartered has about 35 branches located in Lagos, Port Harcourt and Abuja. And South Africa's opposition party, the EFF, has released a joint statement with massive cellular telecoms company Vodacom. It says the two entities have resolved a dispute after EFF supporters trashed various stores around the country. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. We're heading into a short break now, still to come. .2% GDP growth takes South Africa out of recession. And Tunisia's dairy dispute could bring production in the country to a halt.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in. See, business in Africa is high risk. After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN. Let's head to South Africa now. The country has officially moved out of recession after reporting a 2.2% growth in GDP for the third quarter of this year. Now, South Africa snapped out of recession after a revised 0.4% contraction in the second quarter. The economic growth was largely driven by manufacturing, agricultural and transport sectors. The country's economy fell into its first recession since 2009. That's after facing 2 quarters of negative growth. Well, let's delve further into these numbers with Angelo Coppola. He joins us now in Johannesburg. Welcome to the show, Angelo. Now, of course, as we mentioned, recoveries in manufacturing, agriculture, key drivers of this recovery. But we did see key sectors such as mining contracting in the third quarter. Analysts, of course, are also doubting how sustainable this growth is, given how we've seen how consumption heavy we've seen these drivers of growth were these quarter. So, Angelo, what has been the response to these numbers so far?
Well, look, the currency's reaction is always a good indicator of any data release, and the rand aggressively appreciated against the dollar, in fact, and the other major currencies after that official announcement earlier today, strengthening by around 1% before unfortunately giving most of those gains back at the close of business. It's good news for some, but according to the Trade Union Federation, SAFTU, not so for the 37.3% of the South Africans without jobs, the 6 million children living below the food poverty line, and all the other millions living in poverty and hunger. Meanwhile, the organized business sector says a more investor-friendly environment, along with the impact of that stimulus package by President Ramaphosa and efforts at a recovery plan, should result in some sustainable economic improvement over the medium term. So it's a mixed reaction based on the constituency that you happen to represent at the time, Uche.
Well, Angelo, does this recovery change the overall outlook for the economy, given the fact that we've seen the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury forecast annual growth of less than 1% for this year?
Well, Yes and no. While the third quarter data does represent or present a solid foundation to build on, a portfolio manager tells me that he remains circumspect about the future growth prospects. The short-term impetus is encouraging, he says, but may be affected by Eskom's power generation issues that it's having at the moment, and that's going to affect economic output. Forecasts are generally also expecting growth to accelerate towards 2% in 2019, but the global growth that is plateauing at the moment, and the backdrop for accelerating domestic growth, I'm told, could prove challenging. Meanwhile, a bank economist says that they are increasingly, as they put it, concerned about the downside risks to the growth over the next few months, because they watch the South African Reserve Bank's leading indicator, and according to them, that hasn't shown any meaningful acceleration in months. Uche.
Well, what then does this mean for President Ramaphosa's economic stimulus plan, which we saw him announce at the end of September? Shouldn't this signal some sort of improvement, or that his plan is bearing some fruit, or at least he's helping confidence in the country?
Well, look, it's probably too early for any evidence in the GDP data to show a trend based on that stimulus plan. Until we actually see investment flows and developments from that jamboree that happened in September, there won't be any impact on the data. At the earliest, we could see some positive impacts in Q2 next year, but depending on what's being built and how many people are employed, and that's when we start seeing a change. In terms of confidence levels, on the other hand, they'll be buoyant but won't reflect in any GDP data. Those confidence levels generally appear in confidence surveys that are put together by different associations and groupings of researchers, and it has moved up slightly. That could stimulate more investment and job creation, but that's going to take some time, Uche.
Well, as always, many thanks, Angelo, for your analysis. Of course, Angelo Coppola joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, staying in the country, the G20 meetings are over, and according to the South African Institute of International Affairs, the summit took place amidst a fracturing of the multilateral order. Everything from NATO to the consensus on climate change appears to be coming apart at the seams. Well, the G20 has a global crisis on its agenda, and this time it has assumed the form of a mounting trade war between the United States and China. Angelo Coppola spoke with Cobus Van Staden at the Institute.
So what were the key outcomes for the world from this G20 meeting this time around?
A slight pausing of the trade war, I think, would probably be the biggest news, and probably also quite good news, I think, for everyone. I think everyone's desperately trying to avoid the actual resumption of the trade war. But it's going to be quite a complicated thing to achieve. They essentially just kick the can down the road.
Now, is there a case to be made for more African country involvement in the G20 or not?
AU and NEPAD also, are also invited regularly as observers, and this time they did a lot of work to try and get them into all of the preparatory meetings, not just to the final summit. So they did get a little bit more of a voice in, but I agree that there's a strong need for more African representation on the G20. The problem is the G20 is its strong point is that it's a relatively small and manageable group. So the wider you open it up, the less manageable it becomes.
There are lots of local, regional and international groupings. Does the G20 still have a role to play in the world's affairs?
The G20, was very effective during the economic crisis of 2008. And at its best, it's a norm creator. The problem is at the moment, some of the biggest countries in the G20 are not on the same page in terms of most norms. So the G20 was I think largely against the will of most of the members. It was forced to soften the language on protectionism, for example, this time. So there are internal divisions within the G20 that's making it difficult to function as a body.
Well, let's turn our attention now to East Africa's biggest economy, where the capital markets have been in a deep slump for most of 2018. Now, in this quarter, the mortgage lender Housing Finance, the industrial group Samir, and the cement maker Bamburi have all issued profit warnings. Now, by the close of trading on the 4th of December, the benchmark NSE 20 had fallen by 24.5% so far in 2018. Meanwhile, the all-share index had fared no better with a 14.4% decline over the same period. The corporate bond market is also virtually frozen, especially in the wake of liquidation or the liquidation and the receivership of Imperial Bank and Chase Bank, respectively. Now, between them, the two firms had over $60 million of outstanding corporate bonds. Kenya, of course, still has its rate cap in place, and from January 2019, a 30% compensating tax will apply on proceeds from bonds. Now, earlier, I asked the CEO of the Nairobi Securities Exchange how the bond market can be revived amidst these challenges.
Debt capital, especially capital market debt capital, is still a very attractive opportunity. One, because it comes, it's easier to access, it comes at less stringent securitization requirements, unlike bank deposits, bank loans, etc. And so we are working very hard, especially with large corporates that have got higher credit ratings. You remember East Africa Breweries were able to do 2 tranches of a very successful bond issuance. They did 6 billion shillings, I think it was last year, highly oversubscribed. Right. So we do believe that any large corporate, supranational institutions, IFC, FDB, if they want to issue bonds in Kenya in local currency, it'll be highly successful. Right. We are conscious that for you to issue a corporate bond at this time, there's normally you normally have to rank or issue it at a premium to a similar instrument, say the government, what they call risk-free assets, for instance, government sovereign debt paper. And the fact that we've now removed the lower threshold of the interest rate caps, okay, that then provides some room for issuers to be flexible and be able to just price their assets just slightly above the government paper. When we had that cap on both sides, then it made an issuance very, very unattractive because investors were asking for cap plus. But now I believe that any corporate coming now, if a government paper, a 5-year government paper is at 11%, you could probably just price 1% higher and at 12% and still be able to raise the money. I think investors are very confident about the market and really about the issuers. Of course, we're still working with the central bank and other CMA to find ways of resolving those 2 other papers, because we believe if we're able to unlock that, then we'll fully restore the confidence in the market. Yes.
Well, we do have a compensating tax, which of course is part of the Finance Act of 2018. It will apply at a rate of 30% to proceeds from tax-free bonds, and that's from the 1st of January 2019. So do you expect this to further suppress interest in the bond market? How do you expect that to impact investors' interest?
We have reprofiled our current bondholders and tried to just see how heavy the impact will be, because this tax actually affects distribution beyond to the underlying shareholders. So, for instance, if you're a collective investment scheme or if you're a mutual fund and you want to distribute that the income, then the ultimate shareholder pays the compensating tax. However, these assets, for instance, the collective investment schemes, some of them have got tax-free status, meaning that they're tax exempt from income tax owing to their registration, and that's what we're exploring. Pension funds are definitely not tax exempt, so hence they do not have to pay their tax. Direct retail, who buy the bonds directly in the market, don't have to pay that tax. So we really have to do a full scan to see what is the real impact of this, and how is it going to affect the ultimate beneficiary. So if we had a heavy sector that were in a collective investment schemes which are not registered, hence then the impact would be great. Right. It was a bit of a surprise for us as well, because when we were discussing the finance bill, we did not. This was not one of those that was on the table for discussion. So we will be re-engaging the National Treasury.
Of course, CEO of Nairobi's Securities Exchange there. Well, let's move on now. The ongoing COP24 Climate Summit in Poland has created an opportunity for German businesses to introduce more green technology to Africa. Now, African business leaders will join their German counterparts to discuss ways to cooperate on infrastructure projects. Here's Iris Spitzer with more on that.
Germany hopes to ride its expertise in green technology all the way to Africa. Concepts like this electric cargo bike, sustainable infrastructure, and renewable energy projects have piqued the interest of African officials.
The good German technologies that can affect Accra, Ghana, and Africa in general, we want to know them. And when we know them and we are teachable enough, we'll be able to apply them.
This conference is part of a recent push by the government to increase private sector cooperation on the African continent.
Germany's development minister said he plans to unveil an initiative at COP24 geared towards developing nations, many of which are in Africa. That initiative is based around increasing private investment in renewables and other climate-related projects.
Germany is playing catch-up to China, which has invested heavily in African infrastructure in recent years. Still, event organizers are optimistic they've found a niche.
You also have more complicated energy grids, communication grids, etc. that are needed, where maybe German industry can be more competitive than when it comes to pure road construction.
Liebing also foresees opportunities to partner with Chinese firms. However, challenges remain, including changing the perception in Germany that African investments are risky. While African countries haven't been the main drivers of climate change, they will certainly feel the effects. And Germany believes its technology has a key role to play in addressing this global challenge. Ira Spitzer, CGTN, Berlin, Germany.
Of course, you're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now. Still to come. France makes a U-turn on increased fuel prices after 2 weeks of chaos. And Russia, along with Saudi Arabia, extend cooperation to balance the oil market into 2019.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Just about 1:30, let's recap today's headlines. About 15 Libyan migrants have died in a boat off the Libyan coast, according to an Egyptian survivor who spoke to Reuters news agency. Now, the survivor said there had been 25 migrants on a boat when they set off from the western Libyan town of Sabrata. After 12 days at sea without food and water, 15 of them perished. And in South Sudan, at least 125 women have been raped or sexually assaulted over a 10-day period in a series of attacks near the Bentiu area. A UN report says the sex attacks took place in a government-controlled area of the country. Many were violently beaten and robbed. Reports indicate that some victims were under 10, others over 65 years of age. Finally, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women has begun a 4-day meeting in Nigeria's city of Lagos. Now, the talks are being held with traditional and religious leaders on child marriage and female genital mutilation in Africa. The global body has urged traditional leaders to protect the girl child from these cultural practices. And that's a recap of today's headlines. Now, on the international front, fuel tax rises, which had led to weeks of violent protests in France, have been suspended for 6 months. Prime Minister Edouard Philippe says that people's anger must be heard and the measures will not be applied until there had been a proper debate with those affected. Now, the protests have hit major French cities, causing considerable damage for the past 3 weekends. The demonstrations have now grown to reflect more widespread anger at the government. 3 people have died since the unrest began and the resulting violence and vandalism. Meanwhile, Russia and Saudi Arabia have agreed to extend their cooperation to balance the oil market into 2019. This, of course, has paved the way for a deal of OPEC meetings, an OPEC meeting this week in Vienna, Austria. The OPEC Advisory Committee recommended a cut of 1.3 million barrels a day last week, but the group received an unexpected cut of 325,000 barrels a day from Canada. Now, steady production and record oil output has helped Saudi Arabia offset losses after U.S. sanctions on Iran. The respective shares of supply are based on the October output, as the International Monetary Fund estimated the price each member of the bloc needs to balance its 2018 budget. Meanwhile, the trade war between the world's 2 biggest economies has hit the American soybean sector quite hard. But news of China's possible plan to buy more U.S. agricultural products has given the bean prices a boost. American farmers are viewing the truce agreed on by President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping as a positive step forward. Here's CGTN's Dan Williams with more.
After a brutal year for U.S. farmers, finally a sign of hope. The Illinois Farm Bureau's annual meeting brought together farmers from across the state. The main topic of discussion, the trade truce agreed between US President Donald Trump and China's President Xi Jinping. As part of that truce, the White House announced China would immediately resume buying some American agricultural products. Beijing hasn't confirmed that detail, so there remains some confusion as to the precise agreement. But what is clear that the US is delaying additional tariffs on Chinese imports for 90 days, as the 2 sides ramp up efforts at negotiation. US Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue is optimistic about the future direction.
As you know, the 90-day cooling off period where we won't go to 25% tariffs on those additional $200 billion is a great opportunity for us to get serious to make the decisions that will benefit both countries. We would love to restore the trade. Our farmers have borne the brunt of the retaliatory tariffs, and I'd love to see them removed.
Illinois is the leading producer of soybeans in the US. Over the last few months, the price of soybeans has fallen below the cost of production.
For farmers here, news of the truce is being seen as an important positive step. But given the developments over the last year, few here are getting carried away with the announcement just yet.
It's a beginning step, and that's the most important aspect. It's a start. And that's not just President Trump, but both presidents have agreed that they're going to have a discussion, of which we haven't had for a long time. It's just a beginning point.
While other farmers remain concerned about the potential long-term damage in trade relations.
They've stepped up and understand the position they've put us in and have been doing a lot to try and get over the hump and get this done before it does any long-term damage to our trade relations, not just with China, but the rest of the world, because once we're looked at as an unreliable source, then other countries pick up on that and go, well, if they'll do that to China, maybe we can't count on them.
It has been a tough year for US agriculture and for soybean farmers in particular. But many here hope this development will finally bring some much needed relief. Dan Williams, CGTN, Chicago.
And moving on now, Chinese President Xi Jinping is now in Portugal for a 2-day visit. He was welcomed with a formal ceremony in the capital by Portugal's President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. Now, this is the first time a Chinese head of state has visited Portugal in about 8 years. President Xi aims to expand cooperation between the 2 nations. Now, President Xi will lay a wreath at the tomb of Portugal's most famous poet, Luís de Camões. He'll then meet with his Portuguese counterpart and visit an exhibition on the maritime Silk Road. Ahead of his trip, President Xi said he hoped to reinforce the friendship between China and Portugal. Meanwhile, officials at Portugal's southern deepwater port of Science says that the facility could play a key role in China's Belt and Road Initiative by enlarging its scope to the Atlantic Ocean. The government's plans to build a new container terminal are also attracting attention from Chinese investors. And here's CGTN's Zhang He with more.
Port of Sines is the main maritime hub in Portugal. The town is also the birthplace of explorer Vasco da Gama, who found a direct sea route from Europe to India through the Atlantic Ocean. His discovery enabled Portugal to establish rich trade with Asian countries.
Portugal has a history which is linked to our historical movement on the 15th and 16th century. We were the first Europeans to arrive in China, and now so that means we have a maritime Silk Road, the first maritime Silk Road, and now China proposes another way coming from China to the west, namely to Europe, to cooperate, to make trade, to work together.
After decades of development, the port of Sines has grown into an important port for cargo containers. It can receive the largest vessels in the world and operates more than 5,000 container trains per year to and from Europe.
Sines is Portugal's busiest port, handling over half of the country's total cargo volume. Now, Portugal hopes it can further promote the Europe-Asia connectivity under China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Portugal's government has signaled its willingness to develop the port as part of the 21st century maritime Silk Road, deepening the connection between Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America. It also planned to expand the railway link to Madrid, which would further strengthen its trade relationship with China.
Think about the map, geography of Portugal. It's the main entrance for Europe coming by sea, and the final way of railways coming by from China, where the land ends and the sea begins, and or vice versa. Okay, so that's why you will hear a lot about Sines.
Port of Sines authorities are now seeking to add a new container terminal to handle an increase of the transshipment. The tendering process will start at the end of this year. The Portuguese government has already sent a trade mission to China to lure investors for the €600 million extension project.
We have noticed the interest of the Chinese operator to know more details of these projects, and they recognized that there is a great potential investment. In addition to the business mission, we have also received several delegations from China companies that we are willing to learn about the operation from the port of Sines and about the new Vasco da Gama terminals.
Portugal has been a seafaring nation for many centuries. Officials here hope this port will help the country reaffirm its key position on the new maritime Silk Road. Zhang He, CGTN, Sines, Portugal.
Now, China has become one of the world's most watched and hottest inbound tourist centers. According to a report released by market research firm Euromonitor International, China is expected to surpass France as the world's #1 tourist destination by 2030. While CGTN's Mark Fontes tells us why China's tourism keeps booming.
Dim sum, the Great Wall, Tibetan Buddhism, all are symbols synonymous with China, and these and other icons are becoming more and more familiar to foreigners. China's tourism rates have greatly expanded in the 4 decades since its reform and opening up. Officials with travel agency Ctrip say of the 139 million people who visited China in 2017, a growing number, 29.16 million, were foreign tourists.
I think probably the history here is very, very interesting. It's such an old country, so we did a lot of like the tourist attractions while we were here too.
The Great Wall, because I think that it's amazing. I believe that something that it's really huge, really Asian, so it should be something very, very important and specific for our culture.
Going to central Beijing, to the Dongcheng district, and walking around in the Hutongs, and this is very nice. It's very charming, for me even more charming than the new parts.
It's open. Here people are open-minded. You can find everything what you want, what you need, and it's really safe here, so that's why I'm here. I realize that it's everything like at home. It's different language, but I feel something similar here.
The 2022 Winter Olympic Games are set to take place in Beijing and towns in nearby Hebei province. C-Trip officials say Beijing 2022 will only add more momentum to the growing Chinese tourism boom.
从历史经验来看，体育赛事一直是东道国。
Historically, sporting events have been an important factor for host countries to attract foreign tourists and promote tourism growth. For example, Russia hosted this year's World Cup. The number of Chinese who applied for Russian tourist visas was much higher this summer versus the same period in 2016. You can expect the same sort of thing for our Beijing Olympics.
奥运会亦是如此。
Yen adds that inbound foreign tourists stay an average of 3 days in China, with Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou the top 3 destinations.
可能第一是因为上海
Shanghai and Beijing have excellent economic development. Secondly, the transportation between these two cities is convenient, and their hotel quality and high level of service personnel are also important factors in attracting foreign tourists to China.
And as more and more overseas tourists come to China, they have some advice for other foreign tourists.
Do your research before you come, because it is such a big country, to figure out exactly what sites you want to see before you come.
And having the translation app, anyone, and downloading the offline package, it just means that I'm able to communicate with people in shops, in taxis, in restaurants, which I was not able to do without that.
It's an adventure, and if somebody has something new to discover, finally Asia is that place to come.
In a country of nearly 1.5 billion people, there's much to see and do. Mark Fontes, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, now here's a quick look at how commodities performed today. We saw oil prices rising more than 1%, extending gains ahead of expected output cuts by OPEC and a mandated reduction in Canadian supply. Meanwhile, we saw gold prices climbing to a more than 5-week high today as the dollar sagged. That's after US and China agreed on a 90-day pause to fresh trade tariffs. Let's take a short break now, still to come. A Ghanaian artist transforms tree branches into stunning pieces of furniture. And a refugee tailor fashionably defies disability in Kenya.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. let's go to Ghana now, where an artist has found an innovative way of using tree branches to make furniture. Emmanuel Boadu believes instead of using the branches as firewood, he not only preserves nature but does it in an artistic way. Nabil Ahmed Rufai has his story.
These branches serve as firewood for many, but Emmanuel Boadu sees them as precious raw material for his art.
I select the wood from other woods that are not hard, especially for furnitures and other beds and other things. I use orange and guava and other stuff. And aside that, I treat some of them so that it can last for long.
Emmanuel says it's taken years to perfect his product. A set of furniture costs $600. It takes Emmanuel up to a day to make a piece such as this. He hopes to train more people in this craftsmanship in order to meet the demand. And his customers are satisfied.
These ones are unique, artistically looking at it. And then even the concept that it brings up, I mean, this is unique. And you can't find this anywhere else. So you buy one and it's almost like it's tailor-made for you.
Emmanuel has big dreams for his unique furniture.
I hope to export this product from Ghana one day.
And as Emmanuel gets more creative with his furniture, he plans to hold an exhibition of his pieces to show them off as works of art. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Well, let's go to Kenya now for a story on a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo that is defying disability. Now, despite having a physical disability, she has managed to establish a successful tailoring business, she's now even employing other refugees. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with a report.
In this corrugated shop in northern Kenya, Horta Biclair stitches fabric for her successful dressmaking business, something made all the more impressive by the challenges she has overcome. Since she was a child, Biclair has lived with a debilitating spinal condition. On top of that, 6 years ago, she was forced to flee her home in the Democratic Republic of Congo to this refugee camp in Kakuma, home to 185,000 refugees.
After 2 weeks in Kakuma, I met someone who employed me. After working for 7 months, I saved some money. I was able to buy a second-hand machine and start my own business.
Today, and with the help of a $1,000 loan from the UN Refugee Agency, Biclair has grown her business to 7 sewing machines and employs 7 other refugees as tailors. But her condition makes the work hard.
Sometimes I get tired, but I work hard because my children depend on me. Even with my disability, they need a parent to take care of them.
I like Biclair because whenever Biclair said, come tomorrow, you come tomorrow and pick your dress when it's ready.
The World Health Organization estimates that some 15% of the global population lives with some form of disability. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Now, FEMA, the continent's largest regular fashion event, has been held in the city of Dakhla, just southwest of Morocco. The event gathered designers, models and fashion experts from across the continent and abroad for a week of festivities and shows. CGTN's Yasser Hakim was there and brings us this report.
For the first time in 20 years, the prominent FEMA Fashion Festival was held outside of Niger. The festival attracts experts from around the world to explore African fashion.
I'm very excited to learn more about it. African culture is always something I've wanted to learn more about. So I'm really excited to see how they use color versus, places like Paris and New York and Milan. And now coming here, I feel like it'll just be a whole new world of discovering the different palettes and textures and everything like that.
The backdrop in 2018 is the city of Dakhla, southwest of Morocco. Dakhla is a small coastal town with a population of just over 110,000 people. The vast coast makes it an attractive beach destination and a major hub for surfers worldwide. The white sand is the main touristic attraction in Dakhla. It's a sandy cliff that leads to a huge lake in the middle of the desert. White sand is an ideal spot for surf lovers and desert safari adventurers. The city itself is also famous for its small bazaars that sell traditional Moroccan and African costumes as well as accessories.
I think the materials is so